Welcome to the New Horizons small group for this, the first Sunday of November. We are using the Explore the Bible curriculum. We're looking at the books of Numbers and Deuteronomy. Today we're in session number 9, entitled Love, and we're in Deuteronomy chapter 6. So Explore the Bible curriculum, the books of Numbers and Deuteronomy, session number 9, entitled Love, and it's Deuteronomy chapter 6. So Deuteronomy, as we talked last week, Deuteronomy is the fifth of the 5 books known as the Pentateuch, or the Law of Moses in the New Testament. What the book of Deuteronomy does is to restate the laws and commandments that God gave through Moses to the children of Israel before they entered the Promised Land. So we have looked at Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and we know that God began to give the children of Israel their laws in the book of Exodus. He continued to give them laws that would direct their daily living in the book of Leviticus. We know in Numbers they came to the Promised Land, and because of the unfaithful reports of the 10 spies, they were denied entry into the Promised Land. So they wandered the wilderness for 40 years while the generation that had left Egypt died off, and a new generation came on. Now, as we look at the book of Deuteronomy, that new generation is looking to enter the Promised Land. They are back where they started 40 years ago at Kadesh Barnea, which is the southern border of Canaan. And as they have reached that border, the patriarch, the leader of the people of Israel, Moses, is making his final sermons, his final remembrances to the children of Israel, telling them to remember what God has done. So the book of Deuteronomy, while it can be interpreted as a second law, is in fact more of a repeating of the previous law. It's a copy of the law that God gave in the book of Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers. So last week we looked at the first chapters of Deuteronomy, and the book of Deuteronomy is really formed around 3 different addresses that Moses makes to the children of Israel. And those addresses kind of revolve around 3 themes. The first theme is a call for a complete obedience and devotion to Yahweh God. We saw that a lot in the first session on Deuteronomy when we looked at Deuteronomy 1 through about Deuteronomy 5. Today we're going to continue that theme, but we're beginning to move into his second address, where the theme becomes the training and education of children, passing on the tenets of the faith from one generation to the next. And as we get further into the book of Deuteronomy, we'll find a third theme which emphasizes the holiness of God and how to properly worship God. So today we're in Deuteronomy chapter 6. We're going to look at verses 1 to 25. So as we start, I have a question for you. What's the best way for someone to learn? If you have a new task, a new hobby, a new job that you're going to do, or if you're a child in school, what's the best way, the most effective way for anyone to learn something new? Well, the answer is going to be repetition. The more you do it, the more you learn the proper way to do it. When I taught school and was going through the curriculum to learn how to properly teach classes, one of the things my professors emphasized is if you want your students to learn, to remember what you're teaching, you needed to say it 3 times. And you may have noticed, since I've been teaching in this class, that I have a tendency every week to review some of the things we've talked about in the previous sessions, because not only does it apply to students, It applies to adults too. If you want them to remember something, you need to say it over and over and over again. And the book of Deuteronomy is a book of repetition. So as I said before, the first 5 chapters of the book of Deuteronomy talks about God's presence with the children of Israel as they have reached the promised land 40 years ago, as they listened to the reports of the spies, as they rejected God's guidance and provision to enter the promised land, and as they wandered for 40 years, the things that they need to remember now that they are back here at Kadesh Barnea, ready to enter again. What do we need to remember about the last 40 plus years since we have left Egypt? So as we begin chapter 6, I'll just remind you that in chapter 5, Moses talked about the 10 Commandments and the foundation that the 10 Commandments laid for the foundation of life in Israel. It not only directed how they would worship God, it also directed how they would treat each other. So again, going into chapter 6, we're going to look at the beginnings of Moses' second address to the children of Israel. So let's look at Deuteronomy chapter 6, beginning at verse 1 and going to verse 3. I'm reading from the NIV first, and then I'll read from the Holman version. So, Deuteronomy chapter 6, verses 1 to 3. These are the commands, decrees, and laws the Lord your God directed me to teach you, to observe in the land that you are crossing the Jordan to possess, so that you, your children, and their children after them may fear the Lord your God as long as you live, by keeping all his decrees and commands that I give you, and so that you may enjoy long life. Hear, O Israel, and be careful to obey, so that it may go well with you, and that you may increase greatly in a land flowing with milk and honey. So what does the Holman version say? Well, verse 1 starts like this. This is the command, the statutes, and ordinances the Lord your God has commanded me to teach you, so that you may follow them in the land you are about to enter and possess. So at the end of Deuteronomy 5, Moses is recalling how God has given him the instructions, the commands, the decrees, the laws that he's to pass on to the children of Israel. And this is how they're going to need to live. And in chapter 6, he goes from this is what's happened to this is how it affects you now as you live in the covenant once you have settled the promised land. So notice in the Holman it says this is the command. In the NIV it says these are the commands. But any version, any word that's translated there really refers to the entirety of what God has passed on to these pilgrims that are getting ready to enter the promised land. This is all the instructions that God gave them from Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and now as they're getting ready to enter Deuteronomy. It's a reminder of the entirety of the instruction that the Yahweh God has given to the Israelites as they begin to enter the land. When we talk about the word decrees or statutes, the word in the Hebrew means to inscribe. It means what's been written down. And if you'll remember, these laws were all written down on stone, 10 Commandments, and maybe on papyrus or some other skin that would allow them to be read later and remembered. The laws they talk about are the judgments of the Lord. They are the things that God has judged as being proper. And they are the things that God has judged as being improper for the children of Israel to live by. And as he ends up, he reminds them that all of these commands, decrees, statutes, laws, ordinances, whatever word you want to use, all have derived from the instruction of Yahweh God. So notice again, as we've talked before, that the word Lord is capitalized all the way through. And that means this is the covenant name of God. This is the name that he identified himself to Moses at the burning bush, and it's the name that he has identified himself to the children of Israel as the God of the covenant, the God who has made a contract with you. If you follow this, then I will be your God and I will bless you. And if you fail to follow this, I will curse you. And that's going to come into play later in the rest of the book of Deuteronomy. So let's look at verse 2. In the NIV, verse 2 says, we're going to the Holman. In the Holman version, verse 2 says, "Do this so that you may fear the Lord your God all the days of your life, by keeping all his statutes and commands I am giving you, your son and your grandson, so that you may have a long life." Now it says in the verse that you may fear the Lord your God. The word fear here doesn't mean to be scared of. It means reverence. It means awe. It means to recognize that God is the creator of the universe. He is the Lord of everything that you see. And therefore we should reverence or bow down before him. We should have awe of him. And notice that Moses says you need to do this all the days of your life or for as long as you live. In other words, this is a long-term commitment. This is not something I'm going to do today and forget about tomorrow. This is something I'm going to do for the rest of my life. It's a commitment, a long-term commitment to reverence of Yahweh God. And why? Because you're going to have long life and you're going to prosper. And to emphasize the fact that it is a long-term commitment, notice that the commands are given to you, your son, and your grandson. 3 different generations. And that becomes important a little bit later today when Moses impresses upon the Israelites that they need to train the next generation into what all of these laws, commands, statutes, decrees are all about. Okay, verse 3 says in the Holman, "Listen, Israel, and be careful to follow them, so that you may prosper and multiply greatly, because the Lord, the God of your fathers, has promised you a land flowing with milk and honey." Now, in the Holman, the verse starts off with listen. In the NIV, it starts off with hear. Word can be translated any way. But the important part of it, the important thing to remember here, is that in the Hebrew, the word that's translated as listen or hear doesn't just refer to the ears. It's more than just an auditory remembrance. It's an auditory remembrance that then generates obedience, that leads to following what you have heard. Notice he says not only listen, but then be careful to follow them or careful to obey them. Again, this is the same word he's used previously in verse 2 when he's talking about observing the laws, or when he's talking in verse 1 about obeying the laws. All of these words come together to say what you hear is what your actions should follow. And again, notice that Moses points to the long-term commitment that God has made to them because of the promise that he made to the God of your fathers or the God of your ancestors. He's pointing back to the covenant that God made with Abraham, to Isaac, to Jacob, to Joseph, and going forward. This is a long-term commitment from God. God is asking the same long-term commitment from the Israelites as they begin to move into the promised land. Okay, so let's look at verses 4 to 9. In the NIV version, 4 to 9 says the following. "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your strength. These commandments that I give you today are to be upon your hearts. Impress them on your children. Talk about them when you sit at home and when you walk along the road, when you lie down and when you get up. Tie them as symbols on your hands and bind them on your foreheads. Write them on the doorframes of your homes and on your gates. So what does the NIV say in comparison to the Holman? Well, here's what the Holman says, verses 4 and 5. Listen, Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your strength. Well, the verses in verses 4 through 6 constitute what is known as the Shema, the foundation of all of Jewish religion. And if you remember when Christ is asked in the New Testament, what's the greatest commandment? What does he say? Well, here it is, Deuteronomy 4 and 5. The Lord our God is one. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your strength. Again, the verse starts with the word listen, which means hear it, and then act on it. Notice it does say that the Lord our God, the Lord is one, which is a point to Israel being monotheistic or worshiping one God, which would have made them an outlier, would have made them different than all the nations in the area they were moving into, because all the peoples in Canaan and the Egyptians that they left worshiped multiple gods. So the fact that Israel worshiped one God would have made them an outlier, would have made them a contrast to the people they were moving into. And the word that is contrasted here in the verse, to love the Lord your God, is the word that means a wholehearted covenant commitment. God has made a wholehearted covenant commitment to you. You're called upon to make that same commitment to him. Not only a commitment of the mind, but a commitment of the heart, commitment of the soul, commitment of the whole person to be committed to the worship and the following of God's commands. And notice it says heart, soul, and strength. In order to do that, particularly with all of the distractions that they're going to face from the people who are already there, and all the distractions that believers face today, it requires an act of strength and an act of the whole person in order to be able to follow that guidance. Verse 6 says, these words that I'm giving you today are to be in your heart. Now remember previous verse which says written down? Well, now he's talking about the words being on your heart. You don't have to go look them up. You know them. They are on your heart. And if you'll remember in some of the studies of the prophets that we've done, they talk about a new covenant and a covenant that is written on the hearts of believers and not on stone and parchment. Well, this is where it comes from. The decrees need to be something that shape our lives, shape the lives of the Israelites, shape our lives as we move forward. And how do you do that? Well, you have to read and understand what's written down. But not only do you have to read and understand written down, you need to engrave it in your heart. Memorize it. That's why Bible memorization is so important as a young person, so that it's in your heart even if you don't have a written Bible. Notice, speaking of young people, verse 7. Repeat them to your children. Talk about them when you sit in your house and when you walk along the road, when you lie down and when you get up. Moses is saying, as he said previously, this covenant is to your children, your grandchildren, to the generations to come. And in order to have those generations know the laws, commands, edict, decrees of Yahweh God, you need to talk about it with them. And notice when Moses says to do it. When you sit in your house, when you're on the road, when you lie down, when you get up. In other words, there's no specific time to do it. It's any time the opportunity presents itself. If you're sitting at home, then maybe you need to have a Bible study time as a family. If you're on the road, maybe that's a time to talk to the next generation about your tenets of your faith. When you get up, when you lie down, There's no particular time that's better. It's just be intentional about doing it. Don't just do it on the spur of the moment, but be intentional about doing it. Verses 8 and 9 are very interesting because the Jews have taken this, I won't say to the extreme, but they have taken this literally. Verse 8 and 9, bind them as a sign on your hand, and let them be a symbol on your forehead. Write them on the doorposts of your house and on your gates. Observant Jews will actually write the Shema and other scriptures into a leather box that is strapped to their forehead or strapped to their wrist. The idea being is the wrist leads forward, so the scripture is leading you forward, and the forehead is pointing in the direction that you're going. It's to remember what God has said. These are called phylacteries. And they'll also put them on the doorposts of their houses. And again, it's a reminder that these are the commands, the decrees, the laws that God has given. But they have taken it literally, and an observant Jewish man will wear these phylacteries on the forehead and on the arm. So moving into Deuteronomy 6, verses 10 through 19, Moses continues this call to remember what God has done for the Israelites. And then he sums it up in verses 20 to 25. So let's look at those verses. 20 to 25. In the future, remember he's been talking about the children, the next generation. In the future, when your son asks you, what is the meaning of the stipulations, decrees, and laws the Lord our God has commanded you, tell him, we were slaves of Pharaoh in Egypt, but the Lord brought us out of Egypt with a mighty hand. Before our eyes the Lord sent miraculous signs and wonders, great and terrible, upon Egypt and Pharaoh and his whole household. But he brought us out from there to bring us in and give us the land that he promised on oath to our forefathers. The Lord commanded us to obey all these decrees and to fear the Lord our God, so that we might always prosper and be kept alive, as is the case today. And if we are careful to obey all this law before the Lord our God, as he has commanded us, that will be our righteousness. So Moses has now told the children of Israel they need to pass on the tenets of the faith to the next generation, to those who are going to come after. And now he says, if you pass it on, here's what's going to happen. Beginning in verse 20, from the Holman. When your son asks you in the future, what is the meaning of these decrees, statutes, and ordinances, which the Lord our God has commanded you? Tell him, we were slaves of Pharaoh in Egypt, but the Lord brought us out of Egypt with a strong hand. So Moses is going to begin to talk about how to pass on the stories of God's leadership, God's protection, as they have moved from slaves in Egypt to the promised land. When he asks you, assumes that the children are going to ask. And the only way they're going to ask is if you've talked to them about it before. So you've got to talk to the next generation about the tenets of the faith in order then for ask questions and to understand deeply what those tenets are. Again, the reference to the Lord our God suggests that the children have seen you practicing your faith. And by practicing your faith, you lead to the question, which leads to being able to pass on the tenets of the faith. And notice that it takes a story for them. The parents don't sit down and try to just talk theology. They talk about what God has done for them. So he begins by talking about how God brought us out of Egypt. And in verses 22, he goes into further detail. So verse 22 and 23. Before our eyes, the Lord inflicted great and devastating signs and wonders on Egypt, on Pharaoh and all his household. But he brought us from there in order to lead us and give us the land that he swore to our fathers. So before our eyes stresses the point that the generation that's talking actually saw this happening. So some of this generation was less than 20 when they got to the promised land the first time. So they still remember what happened in the 2-year trip from Egypt to the southern border of Canaan. And now they're going to pass on what they saw as children to the next generation of children and the next generation of children. So they are eyewitnesses to what has happened. He brought us here in order to lead us and give us the land that he swore to our fathers. And again, the emphasis is on gave to our fathers. This is a promise God made years and years ago, and now he's fulfilling it, giving us the land that he promised to the patriarchs. Verses 24 and 25. The Lord commanded us to follow all these statutes and to fear the Lord our God for our prosperity always and for our preservation, as it is today. Righteousness will be ours if we are careful to follow every one of these commands before the Lord our God as he commanded us. So again, the Lord has commanded us to follow all of these statutes, laws, commands, decrees, because this is part of us keeping the covenant. God has kept his part. He's brought us to the promised land. We have settled it. We're going to be prosperous. We're going to be protected. Now we need to fulfill our part of the promise, our part of the covenant. And that part is to obey all of the different covenant laws, commands that God has given us. And notice that if we do that, righteousness will be ours. So in other words, to live a righteous life, to live a life in communion with God, in a justified position with Yahweh God, you need to follow all these rules. Now, we know that the Israelites made a promise before they went into the promised land to do that. We also know that in the book of Joshua, we see the taking of the promised land. But we know when we get to the book of Judges that they fell down. They didn't always keep up their promises. And as such, they were judged and then repented and came back. It was a cycle. But for right now, Moses is reminding the children of Israel as they're getting ready to enter the promised land that God has kept his part of the covenant. Now it's your turn to keep your part of the covenant. So what's going to happen? Well, in Deuteronomy 7, God through Moses warns the people not to intermarry with the people within Canaan at this point. Why? Because they are all worshipers of idols and other gods. And if you intermarry with them, you will be distracted. You will be led astray into the worship of idols. So A, don't intermarry, and B, destroy every vestige of idol worship when you take the land. In Deuteronomy 8, Moses challenges them to remember God's presence and grace throughout the 40 plus years that they've wandered, how he has provided for them, and now he will provide for them when they take the land. And then in Deuteronomy 9 and Deuteronomy 10, Moses does take 2 chapters and remind them that you have not always been obedient. You have not always lived up to your part of the bargain. You have not acted like God's people. Remember, that was why you wandered for 40 years. You failed to follow the covenant. And then in Deuteronomy 11, Moses once again reminds the people getting ready to enter the promised land, think of all the mighty things that God has done for you the last 40 plus years as you have advanced to the promised land. The miracles of the plagues to get you out of Egypt. The miracles of the cloud and the pillar of fire that led you across the Sinai to the border of Canaan, that fed you, that provided water, that provided everything that you needed to get here. Remember all of this and keep the covenant. And then next week, we will get into what happens next. So, to sum up today's session, it's to remember what God has done, and because of what he has done, what he has promised to do in the future, and from that promise, to keep our part of the bargain, to follow his laws and regulations and laws, decrees, to live righteously before him. Let's finish with prayer. Heavenly Father, we thank you for this time of study. We thank you for your word that gives us the guidance that we need to live righteous lives before you. May you help us to keep your law. May you help us to keep faith with our belief in your Son, Jesus Christ, and know that when we fail to keep the law, his blood covers it and we are able to go forward, still knowing that we are in a right relationship with you. We ask that you would be with our pastor as he brings your message this morning, and may we learn something from it that we can not only listen to it, but obey what it has to say. For we ask it in your name. Amen.